I really need to hear that point of no return. What happens at 25%? What is the big event that makes this movie? And what is the climax of the movie? And if you don't have those figured out, the other ones kind of don't matter until we figure, if we don't have a nice, satisfying climax for you, let's stop. Let's talk about this. Let's find an interesting climax for you.
This episode is brought to you by Bulletproof Script Coverage, where screenwriters go to get their scripts read by top Hollywood professionals. Learn more at covermyscreenplay.com. I'd like to welcome to the show returning champion, Jill Chamberlain. How you doing, Jill?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be back.
Yes, it's been a while. I mean, last time you were on the show, Bulletproof Screenwriting hadn't been created yet, so you were on the Indie Film Hustle show, and it's been, a lot of things have changed since then. You know, your book is blown up. You're doing workshops. You know, your business has grown a lot. You're helping a lot of screenwriters, and your episode that was on Indie Film Hustle is easily one of the most downloaded episodes in the history of both Indie Film Hustle and of Bulletproof Screenwriting, which is really, I was like looking at the numbers, like, I got to get Jill back on the show. And we have video this time. Before we didn't have video. So that's how old we were back then. So, and your book and the way your book, which is called The Nutshell Technique, the way you approached screenwriting and the craft is so unique. So we're going to get into the weeds of that. And I could say that coming from a very educated space, because I've spoken to every single screenwriting instructor, guru, author that exists on the planet, honestly, over the years. So I've studied every kind of technique, and yours is one of the most interesting, and people love it. Writers love it. They rave about it. So that's why I wanted to have you back on the show to kind of reintroduce a lot of the techniques that you're talking about to this audience that's now listening to both Bulletproof and Indie Film Hustle. So before we get into the weeds, how did you get into this insanity that is the film business or screenwriting and all that?
Well, I was a frustrated screenwriter. I was a screenwriter in New York City, and by the way, I did not stay in screenwriting that long. I sold a couple of things, and I've kind of completely gone into this direction. But when this process began, I was a frustrated screenwriter, and I was getting a note back that was kind of like, very often it was like, why? I don't understand it. Why it's this character on this journey. And I had a hard time interpreting that note. Another way I would put the note, or the way I interpret it now in the language I use, is that I was writing a situation, not a story, which I've discovered in my work as a consultant and teacher is a chronic problem. And what I did was, I partially as a procrastination technique, and partially because I just couldn't move forward. I could tell that I could understand intellectually the problem I had, but no one had any idea how to fix it or to explain how to fix it. And I had a benefit of very good training. I went to Columbia University. I also studied with a man named Doug Katz in New York City. But I needed something that put all the important principles together. And so I started analyzing a lot of movies based on some of the things I knew to develop a universal technique. And, I watched, maybe I'm not going to say I watched thousands of movies, but I watched a good 100 movies or, in some cases rewatched. I still take notes as I watch movies. I'm still analyzing structure. And I was finally able to create this technique that I call the nutshell technique. And the only reason I call it that is because the first time all of these eight elements that are involved fell into place, I kind of scribbled on the page, screenplay in a nutshell. And so the name is kind of stuck, but that's the idea. It's the 8 interconnected elements that are required to tell a story. And it's not, I want to differentiate that it's not a beat sheet method. Most of the books that you're going to find on structure, that deal with structure and screenwriting have a beat sheet approach, right? They tell you you're supposed to hit 15 or 22 or however many pre-prescribed beats that appear in most Hollywood movies. And And I have no problem with those methods. A lot of my writers use those methods in conjunction with my method. It does not conflict with my method. But the issue is that a lot of writers, when they use strictly a beat sheet method, just looking at moments in time, they do end up with a situation instead of a story, because they don't, the principles of what the connection between the beats is not explained. And so, I would say life is a situation. Life is this happens, then this happens, then this happened, then this happened. Mm-hmm. That is not a story.
It's boring.
Yeah, right? Yeah. A story is this happens, which leads to that happening, which makes it ironic when this third thing happens, right? There's a connection between, they're not just moments in time, episodic moments in time. There's a connection between these methods. And I was not aware, I'm still not aware of any, and there were, by the way, over 3,000 books on Amazon on the topic of screenwriting.
No, stop it.
You're aware of the numbers. Yeah.
I've interviewed a few, probably about 2,900 of them.
Yes. There you go. Yes. Right. There are, everybody's got a book on it, it seems. And I'm not aware of any book that that explains comprehensively what the connection is. And that is exactly where my problem as a writer fell, and where I find 99% of first-time screenwriters who come to me, that is where their problem falls, is that they are presenting a situation. There's they might have a clever idea, they may have some great elements to it, but it's ultimately not a satisfying story, because there isn't the cause and effect that we need. And so, and in my method, I have, it's not a purely linear method. It's a visual method. Folks will see in my book, and by the way, everyone can download free versions of my nutshell technique worksheet of my website. If they go to jillchamberlain.com/worksheets, you can download the nutshell technique. And there's one form for comedy structure. And by the way, we're talking about Aristotelian comedy, the academic term. I'm not talking about a ha-ha comedy, and tragedy. And using this structure, it's way easier for me to help you fix your story if we're looking at these 8 elements on a page than if we're trying to do it over the course of a 120-page screenplay. Because we can see visually, you can see what's working and not right there, because you can see the arrows point to you and say, oh, these things don't relate. And only 4 of those moments are really moments in time. We have your first scene, your last scene, what happens at 25% and what happens at 75%. Other than that, there are no beats and defined for you. So there are 8 elements that make up the technique. 4 of them involve moments in time. The other 4 are about the glue that, or what link these moments, how what is the character's flaw that's behind it, and how does that relate to what happens at 25%. So it's the glue that it's looking at, and that is what is the difference between a situation and a story. Otherwise, your protagonist is, if you don't do this or something like this, if you don't find a way to make the journey specific to the character, you're just making your protagonist a victim, essentially. And, even if your character is a victim in some senses of the word, and by victim, I mean basically just random shit's happening to them. It shouldn't be random shit. It is, you are specifically picking this character and this thing to happen to this character for a reason. The character doesn't know that, but that is what's going to produce a story. Yeah.
So that's really interesting, because I love that originally when you started this whole thing about the note of like, why is this character going through this story? It's really an interesting way of looking at story, because you're right. Sometimes you look at movies and you're just like, I don't, there's no reason to what's going on. Mm-hmm. But when you have a main character who has different stakes, different things that they're trying to overcome, and the story is allowing them to evolve as a character, as a human being, that's what you connect to. So, I mean, I always go back to Shawshank. Mm-hmm. I mean, Tim Robbins, Andy Dufresne, from the moment he walked in to the moment he left, are 2 very different people. Even Red is different. Morgan Freeman's character is very different at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Took him a longer to get there than it took Andy. But you see this shift, and it's those specific things are happening to those specific characters in that story. It wasn't just kind of like Indiana Jones got thrown into Shawshank, which would be an interesting, by the way, would be an interesting movie.
Yeah. But a very different one. Yeah.
Very, very different.
Yeah. And I can speak to specifically Andy's flaw. And that's really what the journey is, right? Is we're trying to find the right event to bring out something in the character they've never had to face before.
Right.
And the thing in him that he realizes in the end is that he has a bit of a victim mentality. And by the end, he is taking charge of his own destiny. That he has to, and this, all of this awfulness happening to him. Yes, that's awful. And I'm sure he would prefer it hadn't happened to him. But in the end, it is a comedy, meaning a happy ending, because he has learned and has come out a stronger person, despite a lot of suffering that he went through, and a more fully realized person, right, than the person who had been cold and not present in his marriage and was the whole reason why his wife had strayed in the first place. As coming to accept that about himself and how he didn't cause her murder, he taking some responsibility there, actually has made him a better person in the end. And that's really what the journey is about, right? That's not the plot description at all. You probably won't see any mention of his flaw if you look at IMDb of the I don't think it would mention that. I haven't looked. But that's what makes it work. Because otherwise he could just be a victim, right? If he was an unflawed angel who, if he admitted nothing in the end and he just broke out, it's like, yeah, that's kind of a cool thing, but I don't really care that much. I don't really care, versus having someone realize, oh, I need to change. It's I'm a victim of the system, but the story isn't about me being a victim. It's about me realizing I actually did stuff that I need to be a better person. And this is getting me to face, and getting us hit rock bottom till you finally face it. But
a good story connects with us because it's a mirror of life. Because we all go through our own trials and tribulations, whether that be in relationships, whether that be jobs, a boss, an accident, a tragedy, a trauma. All of these things that happen to us are what test our mettle and help us evolve. I am not the guy I was when I was 25. Thank God. And I'm sure you're not the same person you were when you were 25. We've evolved because of the challenges and life situations that have tested us and pushed us to a place where now we are who we are. And I think I can speak for you. Is like, I wish possibly I wouldn't have gone through a lot of that stuff. But at the end, when you start looking back, you're like, I am who I am because of it. So I wouldn't change. I really wouldn't change it. Yeah. Would you rather not? Sure. But that's a vacation.
Yeah.
But that's not what we're here to do. We're not here on vacay.
Yeah.
So
yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
Do you think that, and I've asked this question a ton on the show, and I always love asking, story experts like yourself, Shawshank is one of those stories that connect at such deep levels with so many people. And I always love to, I've analyzed that film every which way. And I haven't had Frank Darabont on the show yet. And I've been trying to for so long because I want to talk to him about Shawshank for like 10 hours on how he broke it all up and things. But there's a connection there, because I remember when I saw it in 94 when it came out, and I was in the theater. I was in my early 20s, and I had a bunch of knucklehead high school friends still, and we were all knuckleheads, and we went to go see this, and we walked out, and it had touched all of us, even through the knuckleheadness, that it penetrated something so deep. At the time when, Jean-Claude Van Damme was the best actor of all time in our eyes, so we weren't very sophisticated, but it connected at a primal level. What is it about this story that connects with almost everybody who watches it? I always love looking up bad reviews. If I get a bad review on anything, I just type in Shawshank bad review, and I feel better about my own work.
Yeah.
Sometimes because if someone hated Shawshank, someone's gonna hate anything.
Yeah. 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 Well, I'm not an expert in the movie, but a couple things, I mean, that I can say, one is the thing that I said that, right, that ultimately and you'd have to, I could, especially if you're dealing with prison, people wrongfully convicted, we're dealing with rape, we're dealing with some very ugly, traumatic things that you're putting a character through. But again, we're putting him through it for a reason, right? He's a pretty nice guy, I have to say. He doesn't have the most flawed flaw in my book. But ultimately, the story works because of that. If he hadn't had those, if he had just been a nice guy, if he had no, then I think I don't think it would have such a visceral reaction, because you're watching someone be victimized so much, right? That we need to see that, well, there's a reason why. There's something that they learned from it. I think that's one part of it. I think it's also great because we're really following three characters, and there are three different ways that they deal with it, right? The similar journey, but three different characters and three different results, as far as Red and as far as the older gentleman whose name I forget, the senior citizen. I use his character intro. I use it as character intro in my class all the time. Slipping our name, right?
I'll figure it out before the interview is over.
Yeah, but there are three really good journeys, right? That complement each other too, and that they mirror each other. We see how the both Red and the fellow whose name we can't remember actually are in that exact same room, right? And Red was able to handle it on the outside, and the other guy, Brooks. Thank you. Brooks, the senior. I remember the rest of his character intro. Brooks, the one senior citizen of the group, has been the oldest resident. I remember the rest of it, right? And so it's dealing with all three journeys and three different voices. And it does interesting things with the concept of the protagonist, right? That Red is the narrator. Right. And that's typically who we think of as the protagonist. He's also, I would say, arguably the one who does change the most, because, from being cynical to having hope and faith. But it's a product of meeting Andy, and that, I them change because of each other. But structurally, Andy actually is the one who makes the story. I call it, the issue of the protagonist is a whole, we could have a whole episode on that, and people love to quiz me on the internet and things about, well, who's the protagonist of what, this movie, because sometimes it is hard to tell. Right. But one of I'll tell you the easiest, and there are a couple of criteria, but the biggest criteria is typically who makes the climatic choice that's involved at the climax. That's generally going to be the protagonist, right? So it's Andy who makes that. What's the climax of the movie? Is his breaking out of prison. Who makes the choice involved with that? Him. He makes that choice to make this risky move, right? So that's usually going to point to who the protagonist is. And then there are some other factors we do look at as well. So it's got a lot of interesting things going on. I'll say for the script, I use the character intros to this day when I teach character intros in my classes, because I can actually recite to you the character intro for the warden. Warden Samuel Norton strolls forth, a colorless man I may get a few words wrong, a colorless man in a gray suit with a church pin in his lapel. He looks like he could piss ice water.
Oh,
he appraises the newcomers with flinty eyes. Oh. Perfect. Isn't that?
It's two sentences.
Yeah, it's perfect. And it's exactly right. It is, if you go, I love that you have a choice detail of the church pin.
That's it. But that
volumes,
three or four words just loads you up with so much information. And that's what a lot of screenwriters don't understand when they're writing, is that every word they use has to have that kind of impact. I mean, Shane Black's intros or descriptions are legendary. How beautifully he's a wordsmith, the way he writes his his descriptions of things. I was reading, I was like, my God, it's so vivid with a sentence. So that opening, I mean, everything you need to know about that man is done in 2 sentences, as opposed to 4 paragraphs, which a lot of first-time screenwriters do.
Yeah, it's picking very specific details, right? It's just, the church, and then it's a little bit of the writer's voice breaking the fourth wall a little bit, and because you get to do that with a character intro and giving us a psst, psst, don't be fooled by that church pin. This man is the opposite of the idea of Christian charity. This man is so cold, he could piss ice water, So you pick 1 or 2 physical details that are emblematic of the character. And it's a nice way to give us a heads up about the character. And it's a great way to establish your voice as a writer on the page as well.
So we've talked about the nutshell technique. What are those 8 elements?
Yeah. So it's a schematic. I'm not going to go into
but just like the bullet.
I'll just flash. I'll flash. This is what it looks like, if that's on the camera. So there are the moments in time is that we're looking at first of what I call the setup want, or it's an initial want. It's not necessarily the character's biggest want. This is actually the element that confuses people the most, is the want. So I wrote 2 chapters on that, because a lot of people we want lots of things in life. And there's only one want that is actually the one that comes into play specifically at what happens at 25% and what happens at 75%. And so it might not be their biggest want. It might not be the thing that they say they want. It's something they want. And the key is that it's connected. Remember, everything's connected. It's connected to what happens at 25%, which I call the point of no return, meaning it's an external event. And I'm sure anybody who's studied screenwriting, they know something happens at 25%, right? Any book that you're talking about will talk about that something happens at 25%. I refer to it as the point of no return, meaning that it is a external event that happens to the protagonist. So it's not, the point of no return is never somebody decides to do something. Never. It's something happens to a character, then they might decide to do something. And in that point of no return, they're going to get that want. So that's the tricky part. So it's not necessarily, so a lot of times in a movie, it looks like they don't get what they want. I'm telling you, they're getting something they wanted. It may not be the biggest want. It may not be the thing that they said that they wanted, but they're getting something they want. If you don't do that, you're making your character a victim. That the idea is, what we're doing is setting up, be careful what you wish for. The character asked for this on some level, but they asked for it they're going to get it in a way that's highly ironic. So, they get their want, but they get a third element is attached to the point of no return, is the catch. The catch is an upfront problem, right? You got the thing that you wanted, but you're getting something you didn't want. And then I'll go through the linear, and then I'll talk about 2 that aren't. And then the next elements happen at the 75% mark. So we have either comedies or tragedies. And so it's going to be different for comedy and tragedy. But so comedy means, again, I'm not talking about a ha-ha comedy. These are Aristotle's definitions. If you don't like them, blame him. Don't blame me.
Take it up with him. Yeah.
Take it up with him. His definition is a comedy is about a character a hero who faces a flaw and in the end changes and gets a happy ending. And that's the definition I'm using. And then a tragedy is going to be the opposite. It's a character who has a flaw, but they fail to change, and that's going to bring their sad ending, right? So in my comedy form, we're actually going to hit a low point at the 75% before we go back up to, in the third act, to the happy ending. So they're going to hit rock bottom at 75%. What I think Blake Schneider refers to as that all is lost moment, I think is an apt way to describe it. But I would also describe it as being the opposite of where they were in the setup want. So, and that's the tricky part. Again, not every want is going to work. We need a want that they get in the point of no return, and is also the opposite of what they wanted in the beginning. And then in a tragedy, it's going to be a high point called the triumph, which is the highest moment of success, and is also related to the want. It is the ultimate manifestation of the thing that they wanted. And then we're going to be followed by the climatic choice. So the climax is the beginning of Act 3, but central to the climax is the protagonist is making a difficult choice. In a comedy, they have two kind of bad choices. And the way I like to describe, so people say that a great ending is inevitable yet unexpected. That's a pretty tall order, by the way. But that is our goal, is to have an inevitable yet unexpected ending. And
so with that said, I'll use Titanic.
Okay.
Inevitable, but
yes,
some surprises in it.
Yes. Yeah. It happened, but yes, that in Titanic, and we'll use Titanic as my example here, right? That is that she begins by wanting to go overboard because she's suicidal. She's on the rail there, and I think I'm getting this right, because, by the way, it's very hard to nutshell movies on command. I want to cheat and look in my book, because I have to watch these movies several times. It can be very difficult to identify things. Sure. But I believe it's in the moment when Leo rescues her. She gets her want, or she wanted to go over the boat. She wants to get back on the boat. I have to cheat and look at my book.
Yeah, she did. Yeah, she did want to get back onto the boat. And then he convinces her to get back on the boat. And then when she's about to die because she trips or stumbles, then it's like, I want to get back on the boat. So yeah, Leo does bring her back on the boat.
Yeah, the one is to go overboard. The point of no return is when she actually falls overboard. But Jack saves her. And the catch, remember, a catch is attached. She got her want to go overboard, but the catch is Jack. That's the catch. Right. And by the way,
deal with Jack now.
Yeah. Well, and that's what the story's really about, is about what happens when these two people meet. Whatever the catch is sets up all of Act 2, which is twice as long as Act 1 or Act 3. Right. So it's all about what happens when this society girl who is in this arranged marriage is falling for someone who's not in her class, who she shouldn't be with, and who, can't be together. And they actually don't hit the iceberg until the midpoint of the film. So, that's actually not the primary story, and which is kind of a smart thing to do, because
we all know the story of Titanic. Yeah,
we know the ship's going to sink. That we already know that, right? What we don't know is what's going to happen to Rose and Jack. That's
the brilliance of that story. It's so, like, even to this day, when I remember, you and I are both of similar vintage, so we both remember when Titanic came out. Mm-hmm. And everybody was like, oh God, 200 million. We all know it's a boat. It's going to sink. Why are we? This is a catastrophe. Who's going to watch this? And then you go to see it for the first time, among many times I went to go see it in the theater. And you just look at it and you're just like, it's about Jack and Rose. It's so brilliant. And then the class system, there's so many layers to what James did in that. It's truly remarkable. And you're talking about a tragic ending. If you look at Jack's character, Jack changes a little bit, but doesn't change a whole. Jack's pretty much Jack at the end as he was at the beginning, generally speaking. Right. Rose, completely different human being.
Yeah. So she's the actual protagonist. And that's why it's actually a comedy in my book, because her ending's happy, right? We find out she's had this incredibly exciting life. She didn't end up in that arranged marriage. Yes, it's sad, the love of her life died, but she went on to marry other people and have these exciting things happen, all because she met him, right? And he gave her the strength to learn courage, to stand up to society, to not do what people are told her. Had she not met Jack, she would have either sunk, with the ship, or ended up in that arranged marriage and had this unhappy life. That would have been a tragedy. So what's unexpected and what was really smart to do with Titanic is to use this tragic event to actually portray a story that's an Aristotelian comedy. And, while it's sad that Jack dies, he's not the protagonist. And so because he is a victim. We can have characters who aren't the protagonists, who are the victim. He is a victim. It's not his fault the ship sank. There was nothing. It had nothing to do with a flaw of his. That's fine. But we need a protagonist who is. There's a reason why they're being tested on the story, right? And she is being tested about this, which she, unbeknownst to her, this is going to completely change her life. Not so much because she's on the Titanic, but because she meets Jack. Yeah.
Right, which is so brilliant. But so continue with the
So in that case, so the climatic choice in that one, so the crisis, for example, in that one, because it's a comedy, would be actually that she wants to go back on the ship after. She kind of goes off and on a couple times, and I think she goes back to get Jack or something. So she actually ironically wants the opposite. She wants to go back on the ship. And then the choice, the climax, right, is where, to be a survivor and to save herself. Right. That's, and so emotionally what we feel is the climax is, poor Leo dies. And the climax and climatic choice, by the way, are two different concepts that happen at the same time. So the most surprising moment, I think, is, when, he's drowning. But the choice that is involved is that she chooses to save herself. So that's a climatic choice. And the final step is that she, throws away the diamond, whatever that was called, because that's not what matters. And then the other two elements are the flaw to strength. So she started as a coward, basically, right? She's unable to stand up to her mother. And in the end, she has shown courage, right, to be her own person. And that's what this journey got her to face. And that's what makes it a story, right? And not just a sequential events about the sinking of a famous tragedy. That's not that interesting, right? We needed the right character to put in that. Could have used a different character, but this character, was the choice of how to make this a story, because real life is not a story. Yeah.
Right.
I have to remind people all the time, because they come to my classes, they come to my consultancy with their own stories. And I'm not saying you can't use it, but inherently life is a situation, not a story. So we're going to have to find ways we're going to have to find the story in there by which elements, we are highlighting and which elements maybe we're leaving out. And some stories, some true life stories can't be adapted easily. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because that's the problem with a lot of true life stories. Sometimes you just like it might be interesting, might be fascinating, but it's hard to adapt those kind of stories. That's why, I'm trying to think of, there's a ton of really great life stories that have been adapted. Gandhi, just for whatever reason, keeps coming into my head, but a lot of them are really tough.
Yeah, a lot of them fail. A lot of biopics, right, bore you to death.
Right. Like the Desi and the Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball one that Aaron Sorkin did. It wasn't a bio on them. It kind of was, but the way he wrote that script about a week in their life and used that as the backstory to tell their story of how they came up in the background. So because it's too difficult to, like, how can you tell the story of Desi and Lucille Ball in its entirety in 90 minutes? But you can tell. So that's when he did Steve Jobs, he just basically took 4 keynotes at 4 different times of his life and did scenes around it. It's pretty fascinating, but it is. Yeah. What advice do you have for people who are adapting true life stories?
Yeah. So to be aware of the fact you are inherently dealing with a situation, not a story. That's what you're starting with, right? Life is not a story. It's a situation. So to know that going in there, that means you're going to have to figure out. That's why structure is going to be really important. Structure, really all structure means is the events you choose to show in the order you choose to show them. That's all it means, right? And so, I was at a party where someone introduced me. I ran into a student who was with a famous documentary filmmaker who I will not name, and she introduced me as her teacher, her screenwriting teacher, who wrote a book on structure. And his attitude was, to me, was a little bit like structure smucture. And so I asked him, I said, your documentary films, just so I understand, are they 90 minutes with the camera like on one person with no cuts at all? And he was like, no, that's not what documentary filmmaking is at all. We cut to different things. I'm like, that's structure. If you're cutting to different things, that's structure. If you're not showing me 90 minutes of real time, you are structuring things. So that's all we're talking about with structure, right? So a documentary, if you're trying to tell a story, and you can, by the way, use the nutshell technique for documentaries. I know documentaries that have used it. Or if you're telling a real life story as trying to do a biopic, you're going to need to choose the moments that are going to be involved. One of the other key moments is, remember I talked about the flaw was one of the 8 elements. And this is hard. A lot of people are doing stories based on themselves. You may have to make your character more flawed than you feel you were, because it's not going to be that interesting to see how heroic you were throughout it when these incredible things happen, because that's not a story. A story, again, is that, someone faces something happens to them, which gets them to face something in themselves. So I would advise being very willing that you better be willing to look at yourself or whoever the subject is in the most negative possible light, because you may have to do that. And then ultimately, some stories don't completely work with that character as the protagonist. And I have a technique I talk about in the book in the last chapter called the secret protagonist that comes in handy for a lot of things, but it can happen with biopics, because you look at someone's life and maybe they were just a nice guy the whole time, and there wasn't a change, and they didn't have a tragic ending, but they had a happy ending. That's not going to fit what we need for a satisfying story. Well, maybe there's somebody else in their life who we can hear their story through that character's framework. And so that character can follow this pattern, because this is what we need ultimately. We need one character to follow either this pattern or this pattern, right? Leo's pattern was this. That doesn't work. That's why he's not the protagonist, right?
And for everyone listening, you're pointing down, going up from down.
Yeah. And so sometimes you have to look to, if you had somebody who, started happy and ended up sad, and that's the biographical figure you wanted, you're going to have to look at other events there and see if you can find a way to make them follow the tragic pattern, perhaps, or maybe that's not going to work. And maybe you're going to have to tell it through their partner or somebody else in their life who actually was affected. That's a technique you'll see sometimes, that the actual, central figure is not actually the protagonist from a structural point of view. And let me just add, protagonist is a structuring device. It really is. It doesn't mean the most important character. It doesn't mean the character who has the most lines. It's the character that fits the pattern of this or this. Either they went up, and then came down, and failed to learn, or they went down, and then they learned something and went up. Not everybody has to follow that pattern, but we need one character to follow that pattern, or you need to find the moments in that character's story that, or their life that follow that pattern to make it work. Because otherwise it's not going to be satisfying. It's
right. Right. So looking at, let's say, a person's life, and there's a meet cute of the two people, like the protagonist and their wife, let's say. In a life, there are those interesting moments where, like, oh, it was, there was a very adorable meet cute that happened and it was ironic because of this and this. Those are a couple of moments you can pull out of a real life story and include it in the story. But if you actually laid it out, how long it actually took,
Mm-hmm.
all the different things, it's boring as hell. But if you take the highlights of those things and incorporate them in a structure that makes sense for a movie, then it works. And I think that's where screenwriters make mistakes, is that they try to like, well, it didn't happen that way. I'm like, well, The Beautiful Mind did not happen the way Ron Howard made it.
Yeah.
The brilliance of that movie is they changed it for and they say for dramatic purposes.
Yeah.
Because real life is, even the most interesting life is, if you take it, you know, an hour of a very interesting life, a lot of times is still boring. Even a course of a year of someone's life, you're like, oh my God, they did so much. The thousands of hours that went through you got to cut through all of that stuff to highlight. And that's editing. That's editing a movie. You're taking, or a documentary, you're taking 80 hours of footage and whittling it down to 90 minutes of the most interesting things that tell a story. And that's how screenwriters approach.
Yeah. I also like to work backwards too sometimes, because it's, you know, we also need not just the meet cute, right? But the other really key moment is that climactic moment to me. And so, you know, a lot of times people come in, and my clients or students, and they're all proud. They filled out their nutshell form, and we kind of go through it. And by the way, I poke holes, and then we try to build it up the strongest. But I'll tell them I'm not too attached to what you're saying, frankly, about the want or the flaw, even until I hear your climax. Because I really need to hear that point of no return. What happens at 25%? What is the big event that makes this movie? And what is the climax of the movie? And if you don't have those figured out, the other ones kind of don't matter until we figure, if we don't have a nice, satisfying climax for you, let's stop. Let's talk about this. Let's find an interesting climax for you, because that's what everybody paid their money to see. So those are two incredibly important moments that the whole story rests on. That if they're not, you can fill out my form correctly, but if those moments aren't, powerful, then it's and satisfying and surprising, then it doesn't matter that you filled it out correctly. We need to let's find you a more, I saw that ending coming a mile away. Let's find you a third choice or find some way to set it up so that we didn't see it, and work backwards from there. I do that a lot of the times.
And so you need those kind of, signposts, to pillars. If you have those two pillars, you can connect a bunch of stuff. I can make anything work if I get those two moments. Right, because basically. You can be like, but until I know what those are, I don't really know your story. Right. That's really interesting way of looking about it, because because a lot of times you're like, when I write, I'm like, oh, I got the beginning and I got the ending. And then once you have those two things and they're good, satisfying enough, then you can the way you connect them is really intuitive. Exactly. You'll just this happens and this happens, and then he falls into a pit with snakes in it, and he's afraid of snakes. Why is he afraid of snakes? We won't find that out until the third Indiana Jones, and things like that. But we just know the two endings. So if you start looking at movies we love, the 25% mark and the climax. And I like to point out, like, to people, who, like my students, they know my book, they like my method. And I sign a movie every week for them to watch and nutshell. And I tell them, don't get distracted with trying to figure out the want, trying to figure out this. You want to find it. And it's the same thing with your stories. Let's figure out what is the big event and what is the climax. If you were to turn to your spouse while you watch any movie and ask them, what was the big event that made this movie, and what was the climax? They don't know anything about structure. They haven't read my book or, watched screenwriting podcasts. They would be able to answer that. We should feel those two moments in our gut. They're not intellectual, really. I mean, ultimately there is emotional stuff going on, right? But it is a gut answer that we should feel. This is the thing that changes everything, and that this movie is going to be about, and this is the climax, right? So I like to start with those first, really. So if we can analyze some of the most popular films of all time, or actually currently right now, the Marvel.
Okay, I'm really bad with nutshelling on command, but we'll try.
Not nutshelling, but just ideas, just general ideas of why things are working. something like Endgame, the Avengers Endgame, the last Marvel, the big Avengers movie that came out.
Is that the one with Thanos?
Yeah, the Thanos one. Yeah, the big battle. The big battle.
And where he sat at the end, or he's at the end.
That's when he sat at, well, he's dead at the end. So he dies. This is the last Avengers film.
Then I didn't see it.
Okay.
I saw the one before. I can comment on the one before.
The one before he's sad.
Okay.
But the last one, well, I can't talk to you about it because I'm going to ruin it for you. But anyway.
Right. The one before I could say, Thanos is the protagonist. That's the interesting structure there.
Really? It is. Yeah, the Infinity War one.
Yes.
Thanos is.
So again, not necessarily the most important character, not necessarily the character who's on screen the most or says the most lines. It's the one whose structure, whose change or lack of change holds everything together.
Without Thanos, there's no story.
That's the story, right? Yeah.
Because there's so many heroes that it's almost impossible to follow. Like you could pull out a couple of heroes from the Avengers and the story will continue. It will change a bit, but it will continue.
Yeah, you could easily, exactly.
You can't pull out Thanos.
He is the story. Yeah, without him, it would be. It's just not even that movie.
Right. It's really fascinating. There was one interview I saw of you that you talked about Fat Tootsie. Can you talk about Fat Tootsie? Because I love that.
Yes. This is kind of the best way I know to explain what my method is addressing when I'm talking about story versus situation. Is that it does require that you've seen Tootsie. And sometimes people are like, why are you bringing up a 40-year-old movie? And I'm like, why haven't you seen Tootsie? One of the greatest movies that every screenwriter should watch. What's wrong with you?
It's such a tight screenplay too.
Yeah. You need to watch Tootsie, people, if you have not seen Tootsie for some reason. But I'm going to talk as if people have seen it because they should have, right? So the plot. So the real Tootsie, the movie Tootsie, is about Michael Dorsey, out of work actor, gets a job on a soap opera, but he has to pretend to be a woman. And at the climax, he reveals, spoiler, he pulls off his wig and reveals, in fact, he is a man. And then it's a comedy. In the end, he gets the girl because he's learned and he's changed. So what if I had the exact same movie, Tootsie? Michael Dorsey, out of work actor, is our protagonist, gets a part on a soap, but I'm going to make two changes. First change is that the part he gets is not a woman. Is a male character, but it's an obese man. It's a fictional, in this fictional soap opera world, they have an obese man who's going to be a central character. And Michael really wants this part. So he's going to get his costumer friend to make him a fat suit and a makeup artist to make him prostheses. And he's going to go in and audition and pretend he's actually fat. And he's going to get the part. And then the other change is I'll have him tell Julie, the love interest, that he's gay. And so Julie can be just as comfortable with him and perceive no sexual tension, because she thinks he's a gay man, just the same way she felt comfortable with the Dorothy persona in the real Tootsie, right? And we have a very similar movie when you think about it. We tend to find it funny in movies when men are dressing up as women. We find it, it can be funny having a little guy like Dustin Hoffman pretending to be a big guy, and he grows to hate it. He's getting in and out of his fat suit as quick as he can before people discover him. It grows to hate it so much that live on the air, he pulls off his prostheses and his fat suit and he reveals he's little Dustin Hoffman. But Fat Tootsie is a situation, not a story. What is the difference, do you think?
So, initially my thoughts are, you're right. The basic story blocks of the story are very similar. Could it be as funny? I argue that him dressing up as a woman in 1980, I think it was 82 or something like that, is funnier than him being in a fat suit. So there's those, but we're talking about really nitpicking stuff here. But the difference, why is this a situation versus a story? I think it's a bigger leap, a bigger transformation for a man to dress as a woman as opposed to dressing up as a gay fat man. That's my initial thoughts, but I know you have the answer, Jill. So please tell us.
Well, you're in the ballpark. That the critical difference between the two, the most important, and I should have said of my 8 elements, really the most important of the 8 elements is the flaw. What is the character's central flaw? Because remember, that's the story.
Yeah.
That's the story,
really.
The external, becoming, pretending to be a woman or pretending to be a fat man, that's an event that sets the story into motion. The real story is a particular a person being flawed in a particular way, having that event happen to them. So what in the real Tootsie is his flaw, do you think?
I think was he a womanizer, I think, at one point? Or?
Yeah.
I think it was that, right?
Yeah, he has a lack of respect for women. He's not as egregious example as the Dabney Coleman character. In fact, that comparison is part of how he starts to realize he's not such a great guy. I think he described himself as a feminist. He thinks he is, but we see right from the beginning him hit on every single woman at this party with the same stupid line, right? He's friends with the Terry Garr character and works with her, but the moment he sleeps with her, he treats her terribly, right? So his central flaw of lack of respect of women is being tested perfectly by having him have a point of no return where he actually has to pretend to be a woman. That's the perfect test. With Fat Tootsie, it is a arbitrary, it may or may not be a funny situation we're putting it in, but it has, unless we give him a specific character flaw that has to do with, and we could do that, right? We could give him a specific character flaw, change the character, and he has a problem with, he's shallow about people's appearances or maybe fat people specifically.
Right. We could do that.
Then you could do that. But the characters I presented, if we're using the same Michael Dorsey as in the movie, it has nothing to do with it. Here's the thing. Yeah. 99% of writers are writing Fat Tootsie, right? They may have a clever setup, but it's got nothing to do with the protagonist, right? That's not a story. You have to find the right journey and the right character to go on that journey. That's what we're doing. And that's what I think the nutshell technique breaks down in a very clear way. And that's, I like, it's a visual form where you can see right there, oh yeah, that flaw doesn't work with that catch. They have nothing to do with each other. And so you can make those adjustments so you can find the most satisfying story.
That's a profound statement. Most screenwriters are writing Fat Tootsie because you're absolutely right. They're writing situations, not story. And I'd argue, all right, so I wanted to go back to one of the biggest franchises in movie history, James Bond. And I always love bringing him up because up until Daniel Craig, James Bond never changed. Never changed. Every movie, he was the same dude at the beginning as he was at the end. It was just adventures and it was just plot and stuff. But it was just basically pieces of action back in it. And it was at that time in history, it made sense, but things had to change. So I'd argue that Casino Royale, which was the first Daniel Craig film, is arguably one of the best, if not the best, maybe Skyfall, it was so amazingly good because of the character.
I completely agree.
Just changed
completely
so much. The depth of the onions, you're like, oh, this is why he womanizes. Oh, this is what, because he was hurt. And this, and you just like, for the first time, you're like, oh, this is who James Bond is. But if you go back, and they're fun, you go back to the Sean Connerys or the Pierce Brosnan or Roger Moore ones, they're fun little, but they're almost serialized. They're almost like Flash
they're
Gordon.
Episodic. Yeah, they're episodic.
They're not really deep.
Yep.
And that is, but we learn, so there is no flaw in the character of James Bond prior to Casino Royale. Once Daniel Craig, then it's all flaws. And then you see he's fighting in every movie, he's fighting something within himself. So is that it's all fair statements?
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with you. right? It completely changed with Daniel Craig as far as it going from being a situation. It might be entertaining, right?
Sure.
A lot of people, we like to see things blow up, and we like the clever things, and we like the bad guys, and
the gadgets and the stuff.
The gadgets and the martini and all that, and it's charming. And it can be entertaining, but I think absolutely there's situations, not stories. I think it's a great example too, that one of my frustration with franchises is that I think you can do what Casino Royale did and have both, where you can have a story and it's spectacle. And spectacle, right? And I feel like there's an either or. I get frustrated. I'm not a big fan of, that's why when you threw superhero movies at me, I get so bored in superhero movies because for the most part, there's not much story to me. And I don't think you'd lose your audience if you had a deeper story, right? The most of the people go there to see the spectacle, to see the special effects, to see the climax, and that's all great. But you gain a little bit more, and I think the Daniel Craig movies did very well. I don't think they didn't do worse. I'm not an expert on the box office, but I don't think they certainly didn't decline.
They were some of the highest grossing of all.
Yeah. Right. So you get both. You're going to get both. You're not going to, and I feel like there's some sort of idea of like, no, we've always done it this way, and this is what people want. It's like, yeah, there more people would want it if you actually had story and not just spectacle. And you can do both. Yes.
Well, yeah. I mean, Dark Knight, Nolan's Dark Knight is, I mean, the whole trilogy, really, from Batman Begins to Dark Knight. But you look at Dark Knight and you're like, oh my God, it's a crime movie. It's Heat. It's basically Heat with a psychopath and a Joker and a cape. You pull out the superhero aspect of it, it's still a fascinating crime thriller. And then you look at something like Logan, which is the last Wolverine movie, and oh my God, the depth in that, and they took that to a whole other place. But again, it's flaws. It's what that character, what Logan is fighting, is so much greater than his physical issues that he has, or that he's taking around Professor X, who's got dementia. The most powerful person in the world with mind powers has dementia. Holy cow! I love James Mangold. I think he's brilliant in what he does as well. But you're right. You can have both, and when you do, that's when things will go. Whole
other level. Yeah, it's whole other level. And like you said, I mean, we're talking about Wolverine. It's the flaw is the story. Really. I mean, yes, you have some sort of external event to put it in motion, but it's really the flaw and how the character's flaw gets in their way that is creating what is the story, right? Otherwise, it's a situation.
So right now, the biggest movie as of this recording of this year is Top Gun Maverick. And I was watching Top Gun. When I went to go see it, I was just going, oh my God. I mean, as perfectly as you can execute a sequel for Top Gun, for the original Top Gun, which is spectacle. It was spectacle. But the flaw and the challenges that they threw at Maverick, having to go back and teach Goose's son and go through the emotional and then there was flaws that he was dealing with in order to, and that's what makes that work. Because yes, it's a spectacle. Yes, the action is amazing. But I saw grown men crying. I was probably one of them, because every dad went to go see that movie opening weekend. But there was something else there besides just spectacle, and that's what a lot of screenwriters don't understand.
Yeah, and that's what hooks us, right? That's what makes us feel. That is what why we care. We may be entertained by the spectacle, but you can have spectacle and emotionally engage us and pull us in, right? And that's going to come down to that flaw. Yeah.
Now, I'd love to ask you this question. What do you think is the main difference between a professional screenwriter and an amateur screenwriter? Besides being sold.
I was going to say circumstance is right.
But just the work, how they're actually approaching the craft.
I mean, I don't know. There's so much that's outside the control as far as the business goes, right? So I'm not sure that I can say there's one thing that is different. I know writers who I've worked with who are incredibly talented, whose scripts I think are amazing. I can't believe aren't being produced, and they're not being produced. And I work with some professional writers, sometimes whose work does not impress me, I'll just say. I treat all my clients, equally. I'm here to help, and I'm here to make everybody's script better. But it's not like there's something inherently better necessarily in the professional writer. I do feel a lot of it is circumstance. I think I could just describe better what's between the difference between the amateur writer who is serious or has potential and the amateur writer who's not. That I could maybe answer. If I may answer a different question than the one you asked, and I think that is, and the difference there to me is somebody who's got one script. Basically, they've got one script idea. It's one baby. Yeah. They think that it will make 200 million at the box office if only they can get it in the right hands. And they aren't. They obviously don't know how the business really works, but they've got just that one baby and that's it. Versus the writers who I think who are on the right track are ones who know you can't just have one script, that they're writing all the time. They're constantly writing, and that they're trying different things. And they're not just writing, they're taking, Hollywood's not looking to discover people. I know people want to think that. They're not.
They don't want unknown quantities.
They don't want, exactly. There are plenty of writers who are in the WGA who've had stuff done, who are out of work but are already known. And those are the people who are they're looking to for the next job, not somebody who's yet another unknown out of there. So you need to make your own opportunities is what, so that's a big part of it, is just, you're not going to wait. You can't just wait to be discovered, because it's not going to happen.
Right. And so everyone listening understands why that is. Why don't they want this new untapped talent? Because before, Hollywood was about untapped talent. Now, as you know, I'm talking years ago, like they were looking for new ideas. The 70s, that's how that's how the film brats got in. They had no idea. Yeah. But now the whole town is run by fear. And if I take a chance on you, Jill, as an unknown writer, or me as an unknown writer, if it fails, I lose my job. And then I have that on my permanent record, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. They're like, oh yeah, they gave this schmuck, $5 million for that script and it bombed. Mm-hmm. They'd rather be able to hire someone who has done a few things, might not be as good, but if everything goes to hell, they're like, hey, what are you talking about? She wrote a script that won an Oscar. Yeah, it's not. She just screwed up. It wasn't my fault. Is that basically the way it looks?
Yeah, that is a big part of it. It is. If you are not already a Hollywood insider and you're trying to get in, you're trying to crash a party that people don't really want you in, and you need to be aware of that. I'm not saying don't try to crash it, but you need to be aware of that. There are plenty of out of work WGA writers who have agents and managers already who can't get work. And I'm not saying, let me just say, I'm not saying give up. I'm saying, I wish more writers were just aware of how the business works, that the script market is dead. The spec script market is dead. About 30 spec scripts get bought a year. 30. How many scripts are
30?
How many scripts are registered with the WGA every year?
30, 40,000 more.
Yeah, 50,000.
Yeah.
50,000. So, and I'm not saying I know that bums people out when they hear it, but you need to be aware of the statistics and how the business works. And so stop trying to think, if only I get discovered, and whine about the way the business works. Well, you know what? That's the way the business works. And while some of it is about fear, it also, just to give it a little bit more nuance, I mean, if you wanted to design cars, you wouldn't send to Ford Motor Company a cocktail napkin where you have designed your thoughts on what the next best car design is and expect to get anywhere, right?
Right.
There are things, there are people who've worked very hard to get there to where they are, and they're not really probably looking for new ones. And so you have to realize you're crashing an industry, and you need to try to take, most of the writers who I've worked with who've done well didn't wait. They did not wait to be discovered. They tried lots of different things. I'm going to mention a couple of TV shows, and I want you to tell, and I'm sure you're going to be able to tell me what they have in common. Letterkenny, Smilf, Broad City, Insecure, Workaholics, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. They all have something very important in common.
I know 2 of those shows.
Okay, what are those 2 shows? What do those 2 shows have in common that you can think of?
I think Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and I haven't seen them, but I'm aware of them. Workaholics. I can't speak intelligently about them because I don't know. I've never watched an episode. I just know of them. Okay.
I love all these shows, by the way. What all of these shows have in common is that the creator started by funding their own prototype. They were either web series, or they were short film that went somewhere, or they had YouTube videos.
Like the Philadelphia, what is it? The one with Danny DeVito, that show with Danny DeVito, and it's something.
Yeah, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. It's a little bit different because that was kind of an internal thing. These were actually that was something that was internally distributed. I don't think that they ever distributed it to the public. These were all things people put on YouTube. They said they did not wait to be discovered. Had any of these people waited for someone to discover them and fund them? I don't think a single one. The odds are incredibly slim that any of these things would have been made. And like I said, I think these are all great shows, and creators with great talent. And so talent alone is not people. They're not going to find you. You need to be your own protagonist and find ways to put it out in the world that you have an interesting voice. That's what's unique about you. There are a gazillion writers already in Hollywood, but what they don't have is you and your specific voice, or your specific kind of humor, or your specific angle. And whether that's to do a web series, or to have a Twitter presence, or to have a podcast. And by the way, I don't think you should just do one thing. Most of my writers who've been successful have done many things. They did a web series. It didn't do well. They did a short film. Maybe it did a little this. They did this. They did that. They did lots of things. If that's what you're interested in, don't just hide in your room and write scripts and enter competitions and network, in LA. If that's all you're doing, the odds are really, really going to be slim. It's not impossible, but it's really slim. Instead, find a way. There are all these, with the internet, there are all these ways that cost virtually nothing, where you can show the world, I'm creating great content. You would be very well advised to come find me, versus putting ourselves as writers in the positions of, please, please, please hire me. What a turnoff, right?
You're so on the money on this, because so many of us, screenwriters and filmmakers, are still looking at the business as if it was the 90s, the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. And the world that we live in now, you actually have to take the bull by the horns and go out there. There's a movie coming out as of this recording this week, but and the interview I did is coming out next week. Marcel the Shell with the red shoes on. I don't know if you're familiar with this movie.
I am.
I saw it. It's amazing. It's amazing. A24 is releasing it. It's this thing. And I didn't know that it started off with a short film 12 years ago.
Yeah, I didn't know they were making a feature of it, but it was great. It makes sense. Yeah.
Right. So they made that. And then they did, like, a few years later, they did another one. Then Hollywood came calling and they wanted to team him up with, like, Ryan Reynolds. And they're like, that's not who this is. So they released a couple of books. So they created an IP to the point where they went out and finally got the money to make the feature on their own terms, complete creative control and final cut. But they had this base. I mean, the first short was watched 40 million times, 50 million times. So, and then the second one was watched 36 million times, 40 million, something like that. So they had this massive audience that they could tap into, but it was just a shell with the little shoes on. talking 3 minutes short.
Yeah.
And it turned into this beautifully wonderful film. But there you go. It was just two creators to just like, I'm just going to put this out there. No master plan, but they at least created something and they kept going and going. That is the future. That's the way you have to do it. And it could be podcast. It could be literally changing your screenplay into a story-based podcast where you find an audience. You could do, there's so many affordable, very affordable.
Yeah, very affordable. Yeah, but you may have to invest a little bit, right? Some people have ideas like, I can't spend $1. It's like, well, you're probably going to have to spend $1.
You have to buy the mic.
Yeah, you're going to have to buy the mic, and put some pillows in the room, and and it's not that expensive. But if you're just going to wait to be discovered, you're going to just keep waiting. And look at all the great stuff we wouldn't have today if these other creators I mentioned had just been waiting. And you're going to have to try lots of things. Yeah,
absolutely. And Jill, I could talk to you for at least another 45 hours. I know that. I'm going to ask you a few questions. I ask all of my guests. What is the lesson that took you the longest to learn, whether in the film industry or in life?
Perfectionism is not your friend. That's why deadlines are great. Sometimes you just gotta get it done. And nothing's ever going to be perfect. Deadlines are great for that. They actually force you. It's like, you gotta, good or bad, you got to turn it in, and you need that sometimes, because otherwise a lot of people won't get anything done. Myself included.
What are 3 screenplays that every screenwriter should read?
Well, the first one I'm going to guess many of your guests have said before, because everybody knows. I think that everyone should read it, but I'll go ahead and bring it up because everyone should read it. The Breaking Bad pilot. I'm sure people have brought that up, right? If you haven't read the Breaking pilot, what is wrong with you? You need to go find the Breaking Bad pilot. It is a must read. Just an excellent example of establishing voice, of the way he's able to lead our eye, and story. It just is a masterpiece. I believe the pilot script is. Another pilot that I really recommend my writers read is the pilot for The Leftovers, Damon Lindelof, and it's because, by the way, the things I'm going to recommend, I liked the scripts better than the final product. So Breaking Bad is a great pilot. The script's even better. The Leftovers was kind of a little too dark for my taste on the screen. But on the page, it is probably the strongest example I've seen of voice, of just out there voice of and I think it's helpful for writers to see how far you can go. And, there are a lot of moments where he stops and says, he describes something and then says, "What the fuck?" It like literally says that in the scene description. This happens. What the fuck, right? He's commenting on us and keeping us engaged in that story. And I think that's a really good example for writers, especially ones who are been taught you only write what's seen and heard, and to understand what that really means. And the last one is another one I like. It's for voice, is Big Fish, John August. Oh, again, it's the script I like better than the movie. I think the script, he just is great with voice in the way he delights us. That's the word I like to use. A good voice is kind of, I didn't have to have that described that way, but it delights. Readers are human. We want to be pulled along, and voice is one of the hardest things to teach. That's something you really have to practice to learn. So that's why the primary reason I like those scripts I think are just excellent examples of writers with really strong voice.
And where can people find out more about you, your work, your workshops, where they can get the book and so much more?
Yeah. So my book, The Nutshell Technique, Crack the Secret of Successful Screenwriting, is on Amazon and basically all the places you buy the books. It is, I don't know if anyone is able to do it, but it is available also in Italian, Korean, Mandarin Chinese is coming out soon, and there's an audiobook version. I'd recommend getting the paperback, because the paperback has nice big diagrams. It's a larger format book. It's easier to see that. So I teach classes on Zoom, and my screenwriting school is, the website is thescreenplayworkshop.org. And I have 10-week classes where you write a feature film or a TV pilot. I have a special class going on right now that's actually only for alumni that I just want to mention because it's really unique, where we are a TV writers room. It's called TV writers room. People pitch ideas for a new series, and one idea is chosen, and the whole class, everybody writes an episode of a season of a new show. It's really one of the only classes like that. You have to be an alumni, though. That's the one class you can't just sign up for. My other classes, all levels take them. Beginners to Emmy-winning screenwriters take my classes. And then to find out more about my script consultation, you can go to jillchamberlain.com. And that's also where you can find the free worksheets that I mentioned.
Yeah. Jill, that is awesome. And I advise everyone listening to go check your stuff out. You have a really unique way of looking at story. And again, I've become an expert on looking at story from so many different angles over the years. And yours is really one of the best. So Jill, thank you so much for coming on the show. You're welcome back anytime to talk shop. But I appreciate you. Thanks again for coming back.
Yeah, thank you. It was my pleasure. It was great fun to see you again.